In 2022, the United States froze more than $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves almost overnight. Within a year, Russia-China trade plunged from 94% settled in US dollars to under 25%. In the Middle East, oil, the strategic artery of the global economy, began trading in Chinese yuan. In South America, Brazil and Argentina started settling trade without touching the dollar at all. The ground is moving. Is this the first crack in the foundation of dollar dominance? The opening act of a slow-motion financial rebellion? Or is it a dramatic illusion, magnified by headlines but detached from structural reality? And if the dollar, the pillar of American power for nearly 8 decades, were ever dethroned, what would that mean for U.S. influence, living standards, military reach, and the future of the American century? The US dollar doesn't dominate because America forces countries to use it. It dominates because the structure of global trade makes it the most efficient option, and that efficiency compounds over time. There are more than 180 currencies in circulation worldwide. If every country traded directly with every other currency, the system would require thousands of exchange markets, baht to real, krona to rupiah, peso to rand, each needing liquidity and stability. Most of those markets would be thin and volatile. Instead, the world converged around a single intermediary, the dollar. Today, 88% of global foreign exchange transactions involve the US dollar. That doesn't mean most trade is American. It means the dollar sits in the middle. When Malaysia trades with Chile, it's often cheaper to convert ringgit into dollars and then dollars into pesos than to exchange them directly. That's the network effect. The more people use a system, the more useful it becomes, and the harder it is to replace. The dominance shows up in the data. Roughly 58 to 59% of global central bank reserves are held in dollars. Around 80 to 90% of global oil trade is priced in dollars, and an estimated 50 to 70% of physical U.S. currency circulates outside the United States, embedded in foreign economies. This isn't just strength, it's centrality. The dollar functions as the operating system of global trade, and it's backed by scale, the U.S. And Treasury market, worth roughly $26 to $27 trillion, is the deepest and most liquid government bond market in the world. Central banks can move hundreds of billions into treasuries without destabilizing prices. Few countries offer that capacity. Then there's crisis behavior. In 2008, in 2020, and even during banking stress in 2023, investors didn't abandon the dollar. They ran toward it. Even when turmoil begins in America, capital still treats U.S. It treasuries as the safest large-scale asset available. That's why the dollar dominates, not by decree, but by liquidity, openness, and accumulated trust. It isn't just America's currency, it's the infrastructure of the global financial system. And replacing infrastructure is far harder than replacing headlines. History delivers a pattern that is both simple and unsettling. No reserve currency lasts forever. Monetary dominance is never permanent. It tracks economic power, and when power shifts, money eventually follows. At the dawn of the 20th century, the pound sterling was the unquestioned center of global finance. By 1900, it accounted for roughly 62% of global foreign exchange reserves. London was the financial heart of the world. The British Empire controlled vast trade routes, industrial output, and maritime dominance. Sterling was not dominant because Britain demanded it. It was dominant because Britain sat at the center of global commerce. It was the safest, deepest, most trusted system available. Then the foundation began to crack. 2 world wars drained Britain's finances, strained its industrial base, and forced it into heavy debt. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from World War II, holding nearly 70% of the world's gold reserves and commanding the largest industrial economy on Earth. Capital flows follow strength, and strength had shifted west. In 1944, that shift was formalized at Bretton Woods. The global monetary system was redesigned around the United States dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. This was not merely a diplomatic arrangement. then it was recognition of a new economic reality. America had become the anchor of global stability. But the more revealing moment came later. In 1971, the United States ended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. By classical monetary logic, this should have triggered a loss of confidence. The gold backing was gone. The constraint had disappeared. And yet, the dollar remained dominant. Why? Because reserve currencies are not sustained by metal. They are sustained by systems. Even without gold, the United States still offered the deepest capital markets, the largest pool of safe government debt, the most liquid financial infrastructure, and the most open investment environment. Oil was priced in dollars. Trade contracts were written in dollars. Central banks held dollars because everyone else held dollars. For decades, the dollar's dominance felt structural, almost neutral. It was the plumbing of global trade, the invisible framework beneath oil shipments, sovereign reserves, bond markets, and cross-border contracts. It didn't feel like power. It felt like background infrastructure. In 2022, that infrastructure revealed itself as leverage. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies deployed financial force at unprecedented scale. Within days, and roughly $300 to $330 billion of Russia's central bank reserves were frozen. Not private wealth, but sovereign emergency buffers. Major banks were cut off from SWIFT, more than 1,000 multinational firms exited, and a G20 economy was effectively severed from core channels of global finance. What changed was not American authority, but global awareness of it. Because trade clears in dollars, reserves sit in Western institutions, and payment flows run through U.S.-linked infrastructure. Yet Washington holds extraordinary influence over global liquidity. That influence had always existed. Now, it had been exercised in full view. The message was clear. The dollar system offers efficiency and stability, but it also carries jurisdiction. Access is not purely economic. It is conditional. For countries neither close allies nor open adversaries, that realization introduced strategic risk. If reserves can be frozen once, they can be frozen again. The sanctions did not end dollar dominance, but they altered perception. The dollar was no longer seen purely as neutral infrastructure. It was recognized as an instrument of state power. And when a reserve currency shifts from neutrality to leverage, dependence begins to resemble vulnerability. Monetary systems do not unravel overnight. They shift when trust becomes conditional. And in 2022, for the first time in decades, that trust was openly questioned. There is a shift happening, but precision matters. After 2022, several high-profile developments signaled a desire to reduce reliance on the dollar. Russia and China expanded bilateral trade beyond $200 billion in 2023, with a growing share settled in rubles and yuan rather than dollars. Saudi Arabia openly discussed pricing portions of its oil exports in Chinese yuan. Brazil and China formalized agreements to settle segments of trade directly in their own currencies, all bypassing the dollar in specific corridors. At first glance, this resembles the early stages of a financial realignment. The data adds weight to that impression. The dollar's share of global central bank reserves has declined from roughly 71% in 2000 to about 58% in 2023. That shift is meaningful. It reflects a world less concentrated around a single currency than it was at the peak of post-Cold War unipolarity. But where the reserves are going matters more than the headline decline. Most of the reduction in dollar holdings has not flowed into the yuan. Instead, it has largely moved into other advanced economy currencies: the Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, Swiss franc. Systems characterized by institutional stability, transparent markets, and financial openness. The Chinese yuan still accounts for only 2 to 3% of global reserves. That distinction changes the narrative. This is not coordinated abandonment. It is calibrated diversification. Governments are spreading exposure, reducing concentration risk, and building optionality in a more fragmented geopolitical landscape. That behavior is rational, even prudent. But diversification is not the same as displacement. A genuine monetary revolution would require a fully credible alternative, a system large enough, liquid enough, and trusted enough to absorb trillions in reserves without friction. Such a system would need deep capital markets, open convertibility, all legal predictability, and proven crisis resilience. No such alternative currently exists. So, yes, de-dollarization is underway, but in measured, incremental form. It is strategic hedging against uncertainty, not a wholesale rejection of the existing order. It is adaptation within the system, not a revolt against it. On paper, BRICS looks formidable. Together, its expanded membership represents roughly 32% of global GDP measured by purchasing power parity, and now includes major energy exporters such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That concentration of economic output and commodity supply gives the bloc geopolitical weight. If a larger share of oil and commodity trade were settled internally in non-dollar currencies, it could gradually reduce marginal demand for dollars in specific corridors. But reserve currency dominance is not determined by trade flows alone. It is determined by financial architecture. To replace the dollar, a BRICS currency would need to function as a destination for global savings, capable of absorbing trillions of dollars in central bank reserves without volatility or political risk. That requires a unified and highly liquid bond market, a credible and independent central monetary authority, coordinated fiscal frameworks, enforceable legal systems, and deep investor trust across borders. Those foundations do not currently exist. BRICS is not a political union. India and China maintain unresolved border tensions. Russia operates under extensive sanctions. Member economies range from liberalizing markets to heavily state-managed systems. There is no shared sovereign bond market, no collective fiscal authority, and no integrated capital pool comparable to the 26 to 27 trillion US dollars. Treasury market, which provides unmatched depth and liquidity. Even the euro, constructed among advanced economies with decades of regulatory coordination, experienced severe stress during its first sovereign debt crisis. BRICS lacks that degree of institutional alignment, legal harmonization, and monetary integration. Could BRICS expand settlement in local currencies? Yes. Could it construct parallel payment infrastructure? Possibly. Could it incrementally reduce dollar usage in selected trade flows? And likely. But replacing the dollar requires more than economic scale. It requires becoming the most stable, liquid, and trusted repository of global capital, particularly in times of crisis. BRICS possesses economic mass. It does not yet possess monetary cohesion. And without cohesion, a reserve currency cannot endure. If there is a single currency with the structural scale to challenge the dollar, it is the renminbi. China represents roughly 18% of global GDP and has become the world's largest trading nation. It is the primary trading partner for more than 120 countries, embedding its currency deeper into supply chains across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Beijing has also developed CIPS, its own cross-border payment system, reducing reliance on SWIFT and laying groundwork for greater yuan-based settlement. In regional trade, the yuan's presence is expanding steadily. On the surface, those are the raw ingredients of a reserve currency: economic mass, trade integration, and alternative payment rails. But reserve currency status is not built on trade flows. It is built on financial openness and institutional credibility. This is where the structural constraints become clear. China maintains capital controls, and individuals are generally limited to transferring around $50,000 per year abroad without approval. Large cross-border capital movements are monitored and, at times, restricted. Foreign investors face limitations in accessing domestic markets, and the yuan is not fully freely convertible. These policies are deliberate. They help Beijing maintain financial stability and prevent destabilizing capital flight. Yet those same controls create friction for global reserve adoption. A true reserve currency must allow funds to move freely, predictably, and at scale. Central banks must be able to deploy hundreds of billions without worrying about sudden regulatory shifts, liquidity bottlenecks, or political intervention. Markets must be deep, transparent, and resilient under stress. And crisis behavior matters most. In 2008, during the global financial crisis, capital flowed into dollars. In 2020, amid pandemic shock, demand for dollars surged again. In 2023, during banking stress, treasuries remained a primary safe haven. In moments of uncertainty, global investors still default to the dollar system. That pattern carries more weight than trade invoicing statistics. The renminbi is undeniably growing in international relevance. It is becoming a meaningful regional settlement currency. But replacing the dollar requires more than scale or trade volume. It requires a financial ecosystem open enough, liquid enough, and trusted enough to safeguard the world's accumulated savings. At this stage, the United States dollar continues to meet those conditions more comprehensively than any alternative. If the US dollar were ever to lose its central role in global finance, it would not fade gradually. It would require a structural break, powerful enough to override decades of trust, liquidity, and entrenched network effects. Realistically, there are only two paths to that outcome. The first would come from within the United States. Federal debt now exceeds $34 trillion, interest costs are rising, and political brinkmanship periodically raises doubts about fiscal discipline. That reserve currency status ultimately rests on confidence in government bonds. If investors ever believed U.S. Treasuries were no longer the safest large-scale asset in the world, capital would reposition quickly. Yet history suggests the opposite dynamic. In 2008, 2020, and again during the banking stress of 2023, global capital did not flee the dollar. It rushed into it. Even when instability begins in America, treasuries remain the default safe haven. For internal weakness to dethrone the dollar, the crisis would need to be deep, prolonged, and uniquely American in a way that permanently damages institutional credibility. That bar remains extremely high. The second path would be geopolitical. Reserve currencies function on collective belief. If a critical mass of major economies concluded that U.S. financial power had become destabilizing, the network effects sustaining the dollar could begin to reverse. But that would require far more than diversification. It would demand a parallel financial system capable of absorbing trillions in reserves, sustained energy trade outside the dollar, and coordinated alignment among major economies. That coordination does not yet exist. Countries are hedging at the margins, but when uncertainty rises, capital still flows toward U.S. markets. Reserve dominance rests on shared trust, and while trust can erode, it is not fundamentally broken. Until it does, the center of global finance remains in the United States. For nearly 80 years, the US dollar has anchored the global financial system, not by force, but by trust. It became the world's intermediary for trade, the core of central bank reserves, and the safe haven in crisis because it was liquid, open, and backed by strong institutions. Today, the world is adjusting. Countries are diversifying reserves, expanding local currency trade, and building alternative payment systems. The dollar's share of global reserves has declined. But diversification is not displacement. The financial architecture supporting the dollar, deep capital markets, free capital movement, and proven crisis resilience still has no equal at scale. Alternatives are growing, but they lack the cohesion and trust required to absorb trillions in global savings. Reserve currencies don't fall because of headlines. They fall when economic strength weakens and collective confidence breaks. That threshold has not yet been crossed. And so, the real question isn't whether the world is hedging. It's whether the foundations beneath the dollar are quietly strengthening or slowly eroding. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, subscribe for deeper analysis beyond the headlines. And let me know in the comments, are we witnessing the beginning of this monetary shift?